This week's episode of the TribCast is brought to you by the members of the Texas Tribune. Our fall member drive is happening now. We need 500 Texans to make a first-time donation to the Texas Tribune. Become a member today at texastribune.org/donate. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the TribCast for Tuesday, September 23rd. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, law and politics reporter at the Texas Tribune. I am solo today in the studio, at least, sitting up here all by my lonesome. Matthew is away, but joined in spirit and over Zoom by one of the greats, the Texas Tribune Washington correspondent, Gabby Birenbaum. Gabby, how are you?
I'm good. One of the greats. Wow, I was going for Rookie of the Year, I think. Yeah. Since I just started, but I'll take it.
Two things can be true. So we're actually taping this on Monday. So as of today, but as of yesterday, when you're listening to this, we are officially into fall, which is exciting because it is my favorite season, and also exciting because it's a season of change, of old things falling away to make way for new opportunities. Which brings us to our topic of the week, the changing face of Texas's congressional delegation. I'll be honest, I do better with the segues and setups when I have someone else in the studio. But, Gabby, we invited you on today because we really do want to talk about it. We've had this sort of flurry of news over the summer, whether it's redistricting or campaign announcements or retirement announcements, especially recently, that seem likely to sort of reshape Texas's representation in Washington, D.C. And, a lot of this is sort of slow-moving targets in that a lot of this won't actually go into effect until, 2027, if we're realistically, once after the 2026 election. But it is a huge deal because both for Texas, like how we're represented in D.C., but also for the country. We have this very outsized influence in D.C., or like to think we do at least. So let's start there. I mean, can you talk a little bit just about Texas's delegation in Congress, sort of the state of the delegation and the role it plays more broadly?
Yeah, so Texas, there are 38 members in the House from Texas, and the vast majority are Republicans. So right now, 25. And so historically, what the Texas Republican, conference has wanted, they have lunch every week. They can then take that to the broader Republican conference. And because they speak with such a large voice, they can really sort of set the agenda for House Republicans when they're unified. And when they have, they have a big voice in the room by quantity, but some of that also depends on, who's speaking. And I think in the last few cycles, we've seen a lot of the sort of heavy hitters of the Texas delegation who had been committee chairs. Kevin Brady from the Houston area was the longtime chair of Ways and Means. Kay Granger from Fort Worth was the chair of appropriations. Some really longtime members retired either in the first Trump administration or the Biden administration. And so a lot of the members these days are in their first, second, third term. And while there are definitely some strivers and some ambitious people, I think the Texas delegation in general doesn't have the clout it once had on the Republican side. And I think that's going to be even more compounded because we already have some high-profile retirements coming in the next election cycle.
Right. I mean, that is interesting. When unified, very powerful. When there's disunity, I mean, what are sort of the factions that we see now, broadly speaking? I mean, is it sort of reflective of the factions we just see in Congress are playing out in the Texas delegation?
I mean, I think there's two things going on. I think one, there's people talk about the five families. It's very mafia-esque of House Republicans, and so that ranges from the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of moderates, to the Freedom Caucus, which is the most right-wing, really fiscal hawks that often are a thorn in the side of leadership. And Texas, there's Republicans in all five families, right? So that's part of it. But also, like I mentioned, a lot of it is just the lack of seniority. And there's very few members these days who have been there pre-Trump one, honestly. And I think in a more somewhat civil time when there was more bipartisanship in Congress. And so a lot of the newer members, I think, just don't have that experience of needing to work with the other party to get things done, sort of keeping the temperature down a bit. And so, what gets you or what bolsters your reputation in Congress these days, and I just talked about this with Congressman McCall, who's one of the members who's retiring, is not necessarily what it was in his day when he came in the Bush era. It's a lot more, I think a lot of older members would say now it's a lot more about getting on TV or, getting earned media and all that, and less about legislating. And so I think that's also part of the dynamic of the Texas delegation. You've got people with like different levels of interest in legislation versus sort of attention. Not that they're always mutually exclusive, but I think that's what some of the older members might say.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about Congressman McCall, who you had a fantastic story on him last week. He, represented a Central Texas district for 22 years, and he announced he will be retiring. Who is Congressman McCall? Sort of what does he represent at this point?
Yeah, I think Congressman McCall, they call him Chairman Emerita McCall because he chaired two big committees, Homeland Security and Foreign Affairs. He's, a bit from a different era. He came to Congress during the Bush era. He told me he ran his first campaign in 2004 on a platform of counterterrorism, like very relevant in the '04 election and not as much anymore. His background was in counterterrorism work, and he, chaired the Homeland Security Committee during the Boston bombings, and he chaired Foreign Affairs during the Biden administration for those last 2 years. And so he was sort of the Republican shadow Secretary of State, people called him in that time, but like from a much more, neoconservative Reagan-esque era of Republican politics. He's a very big Ukraine hawk. He's a huge supporter of Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, just a believer in like American, interest in the global sphere and like participating, much less so that I think a lot of the isolationism and America first rhetoric and policy that you see out of the Trump administration somewhat, and certainly out of a lot of members of Congress now. And so I think he's really been like a voice trying to keep the party engaged in global affairs. But he sort of termed out of leading committees anymore. He's one of the longest tenured members from Texas. And so he told me he felt like it was time to move on. He had a good quote about, you either die in office, lose, get indicted, or you can like leave with dignity. So he wanted to do the last one. But yeah, he's sort of a towering figure, I think, in the party among House Republicans and then also in Texas politics. And so that's going to be a huge like sort of wealth of knowledge, I think, about how Congress works and how the legislative process works. And this is someone who's been to tons of countries and met tons of foreign leaders over the years. And so that's going to be just a big sort of wealth of knowledge in the delegation that'll be gone come 27.
Yeah, I thought like your story really, in addition to capturing sort of his, decision to leave, it does really reflect like this change in Republican priorities. When we think about, I maybe talked about this on here before, but I a couple months ago went to the George W. Bush Presidential Library at SMU, and it was so interesting. It was like right when they were talking, the Trump administration was talking about all these like global aid cuts, and it was so interesting just to see like the Bush administration's priority on like PEPFAR and these programs, and thinking like if we're gonna do this sort of, these political goals or these if we're going to sort of charge into these other countries, like we also should be pouring money into global aid and other things like that. And like, those are just so different than the conversations we're having today.
Yeah, absolutely. And McCall is like a huge, I think, believer in like that former Bush era global consensus. And then, we had an interesting conversation. He told me he understands like the sort of younger person's frustration with forever wars, and that like people who grew up in the Afghanistan Iraq era have a different perspective than him, who grew up during the Cold War. But I think he said he's going to continue to kind of speak out just from outside of Congress for like the sort of American interest in aid and intervention and those things. But yeah, I think it's been an increasingly lonely path in Congress for him than it used to be.
Right. Yeah. It's just interesting when we there's been so much talk. And we're going to probably talk about this a little bit with Lloyd Doggett, but like there's been so much talk about, when is the right time for older members to leave, and like a lot of condemnation, particularly, I guess I would say on both sides about like overstaying age-wise. But there is obviously, something lost when it's like everyone's sort of new and younger.
Yeah. I think that's what they balance. And McCall's only in his 60s. I was like, you're a spring chicken for
right. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, he's not leaving in a wheelchair. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah. Another Central Texas Republican giving up his seat to run for a different office, not retiring, but Chip Roy, who has announced he will be running for Texas Attorney General. A really different character than McCall in a lot of ways, although they are sort of from the same general region of the state. Can you talk a little bit about Chip Roy and who he is and what he represents
Yeah.
to the
So Chip
delegation?
Roy has, been all over in Texas politics. He worked for Senator Cruz. He was his chief of staff during Cruz's like first few years in the Senate. Then he went on to work for Paxton at the beginning of Paxton's tenure as AG, and they sort of parted. You would know more than me about this, but parted on bad terms. And so, yeah, Roy in Congress has been, I think, a sort of chief mischief maker for Republican leadership. He's someone they all, when they're trying to pass a major bill, they always have to negotiate with him. He's the policy chair of the Freedom Caucus, which I mentioned is the sort of big fiscal hawk, farthest right caucus. And so his big thing in Congress has been cutting spending. And so he's, very active in the media. He's very well known to journalists on the Hill. If the Freedom Caucus is acting up and trying to shut down legislation or freeze the floor, like he's the best guy to go to and learn what's going on in most cases. He's got a really great policy brain and can talk through a lot of issues. But yeah, he is someone I don't know that House leadership will miss all that much because they've had to negotiate with him all the time over various things. But yeah, he's running for attorney general, so that'll open up his seat, which is like Hill Country, Central Texas area. Austin to San Antonio. And so there's already a bunch of Republicans looking at that seat, including Mark Teixeira, former Ranger and Yankee baseball player.
Yeah, we've got a couple celebrities in the mix for different seats, which is fun for name recognition at least. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Roy obviously entering like a very crowded attorney general race, although I think some polling shows like he definitely has the highest name recognition among the candidates. So yeah, I mean, do you sort of read anything in the tea leaves of that, of like deciding to run for AG versus staying in the House where he has been sort of, I think, somewhat intentionally like a frustrating character?
Yeah. I mean, I think he talked about, I think, like wanting to spend more time in Texas than in DC, which is like a common lawmaker complaint, I think, about Congress. A, B, he's a lawyer. He's I think he really thinks through things with a legal mind. I have to imagine this is an office that he's been looking at, especially because I mentioned he worked for Paxton, and it's an office he's familiar with. So, and he has, like you said, high name ID. I think it's something that he rightfully thinks he can win, just given what we've seen from early polling. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of members of Congress, and we can talk about Morgan Luttrell in the 8th district outside of Houston, who's also leaving after 2 terms. I think for a lot of people, it can be a pretty frustrating place. And I think and you see this across all 50 states, a lot of people, I think, come to Congress and then leave wanting a job actually in their state where they feel like they can make more of an impact and not just be one of 435.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Roy almost sort of said that, where he was like, this isn't really a job you should do forever, right? Like, I think there's
Yeah.
sort of the opposite of, the McCall argument, right? It's like, yes, you want people to be tenured and experienced, and also like, what a weird job. You probably shouldn't have it that long. It probably cooks your brain a little bit.
Some people are definitely Hill creatures, and I think others come and do it for a few terms. And Roy's been there since he won in 18. So I guess that would be his 4th term. But yeah, I think a lot of people get very frustrated by the sort of machinations of Congress, and it can be hard to stand out.
I mean, I obviously, like you said, I mean, we're probably looking at a pretty crowded race for his seat. I mean, similarly, McCall. I mean, none of these seats are like necessarily handed down to one clear like heir apparent anymore. But it feels like sort of the common wisdom would be that like someone like McCall would be replaced by someone who's maybe more in the mold of the modern conservative movement. Roy is sort of a character unto himself. I mean, do you have any sense of sort of like he leaves, someone else replaces him? Like what that impact, like what is that person likely to be more conservative or just more of a, obviously House leadership would prefer they be sort of more march in line with the
yeah. It is hard. Roy's such an interesting character, right? Because yeah, I mean, he is like definitely one of the most right-wing conservative members of the House. At the same time, like he was one of the only Republicans from Texas who didn't sign on to like election challenges in 2020. So he's kind of an interesting guy. Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of these cases, and I think we've seen just from like younger members in Texas who have come in the last few years, I think, yeah, they're much more in the mold of like a Trumpy America First type conservative. And so that I think that's also part of how the delegation has changed over time, to be, more of a Republican in Trump's image than the era that predated him. And so, yeah, we'll see who comes out of these seats, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being people who align more with like where the Republican Party is in this moment in the White House.
Right. Well, I want to talk about another major change in Central Texas, but before we do that, I do want to say this week's episode of the TribCast is brought to you by the members of the Texas Tribune. It is our fall membership drive. If you are not a member, we would love for you to join our little family. You can become a member at texastribune.org/donate. You can also go to our website. We've got donate buttons everywhere. If you're subscribed to our newsletters, we're also pushing it there. If you are donating, feel free to mention that you love the TribCast. That is very valuable feedback to people who get to decide things like whether or not we keep doing this. And feel free to say you prefer, which host you prefer and who you'd like to see more or less of. Matthew's not here to defend himself, so, write in how much you like me. Please do that. Okay, so let's talk about the other change in Central Texas on the other side of the aisle, which is longtime Congressman Lloyd Doggett announcing he will retire instead of challenging Greg Casar for the newly redrawn district. You did a lot of really great reporting on how that decision came to be, but before that, sort of, how did redistricting sort of pit them against each other, and what was that looking like before either of them made a decision?
Yeah, I mean, for years, Austin, in various iterations of the Texas congressional map, has been cracked so that there could only be one Democrat representing it, and that was Lloyd Doggett. And then in 2021, I think for the first time, Austin has, I think, the highest percent of Democratic voters of the, major metro areas. And for the first time, I think Republican map drawers were like, all right, we see the writing on the wall, and they drew two Austin-based seats. So there was Doggett's, which is sort of West Austin, and then Casar's, which is more East Austin and stretched down to San Antonio. Doggett's was majority white, Casar's was majority people of color, so sort of differences there. But in the most recent redraw, the mid-decade redistricting that you and I have obviously like spent the last several months reporting on, they went back down to one. So they made a sort of Dem super district in Austin. It was of the 38, the one that voted by Kamala Harris by far the biggest margin. This is going to be a seat that, whoever takes it could serve indefinitely, I think, so long as they don't get into any
As long as
scandals
they
or
don't
anything
go
like
the
that.
way,
Right. I mean, who knows?
McCall's
right.
his list of
Right.
ways to leave. Yeah.
Right. So, and it was about, the way it was drawn, it was about 2/3 of Doggett's constituents and the rest were Casar's constituents. So I think there was some question of who's going to run here. And Casar's district was redrawn to be, very few of his current constituents, and it's in the sort of San Antonio area and suburbs, much more conservative, voted for Trump by like 10 points. So I think, I know that Doggett's hope was that he would run in, his old district, the Austin district, and Casar would, try to make a stand for Democrats in a district that's going to be hard for them to win. Casar, who was on the Austin City Council, is very much an Austinite, was like, no, I'm going to be running in the new 37, the new Austin district. So there was a bit of a shadow primary that played out between the two of them. Doggett sort of swung first, and talked about it on TV, put out a sort of email to supporters saying, my experience is worthwhile, and explicitly saying Casar should run in the new 35 instead. Casar behind the scenes sort of started putting together pollsters and endorsements and all types of things. And I think Doggett, to his chagrin, I think it's pretty clear he still wishes Casar run in 35 and he would have stayed, but I think saw that it was going to be a divisive primary at the very least, that it was going to be hard fought. And he still says, that he would have won, but he feels like it wasn't worth, dividing up Austin and, turning into a potentially ugly primary. And he is 78. Double check me on that. So, he's up there. Casar is pretty young. Casar is 36. So he decided that if the maps hold in court, that he will step aside and Casar can run and presumably win in the new 37.
Yeah, it's an interesting case because I think on its face, like if you don't follow politics that closely, it fits into the narrative of like, a young, you know, very progressive person of color versus like an older white man, essentially. But I mean, they're both very progressive. I mean, I think they chair and co-chair the House Progressive Caucus. Like they're very politically aligned, I think, on a lot of things. This is not a I mean, I guess in many ways it is old guard, new guard, just age wise, but it's like not a huge policy split. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, Kassar is only in his second term. He's definitely like a rising star. I think somebody would say he's already the star already rose. He's the chair of the Progressive Caucus. Doggett has been in Congress since the 90s. He's also in the Progressive Caucus. I think he's a vice chair.
Hmm.
So yeah, these are two people who like ideologically are not that different. It's just sort of stylistic. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely like the racial element would have played out in a primary. Um, and that, but I think the whole thing was going to sort of force uncomfortable conversations about age, especially because Lloyd Doggett was the first Democrat to call on Joe Biden to not run after Biden's debate last year against Trump, where he really faltered. So there was just a lot of issues that Democrats are kind of dancing around or talking about more, like post Biden, and figuring out what happened. I think would have really come to the fore, and already did somewhat in that shadow primary. But yeah, it would have exposed, I think, a lot of the tensions, vibes wise and identity wise that Democrats have, not so much like actually on policy.
Right, right. No, it's super interesting. And I mean, interesting again, like just a lot of longevity that's being lost on the smaller and soon to be much smaller Democratic side of the delegation. Yeah, it really I think both parties, obviously, as we've talked about, having a real reckoning about like age versus experience.
Yeah, Doggett's been there. He was elected in 94. So I mean, he's really one
Wow.
of I think he's the dean of the Texas delegation. He's like the longest serving
Yeah.
member. And really he's number two on Democrat on Ways and Means, which is like the most powerful tax writing committee. So it's interesting. He, was there for the era of liberal Texas.
Right.
Whereas Kassar, that's not a Texas that he remembers. So it
Right.
just would have been a
Right.
very interesting sort of it would have been a really interesting primary on that level too.
Yeah, I mean, Lloyd Doggett, former Texas Supreme Court justice, which now feels crazy to think when you think
Yeah,
about where the Texas Supreme
he
Court
was in the
stands
state
now.
house when Democrats had a
Yeah.
majority and all that. I mean, yeah,
Right.
he came to Congress the year that Ann Richards lost the governorship for Dems to never reclaim it. So I mean, the narrative stuff would have been very juicy.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So obviously we're also like just gonna see, and we don't yet know what this will look like, but we're gonna see a lot of ripple effects from this redistricting. A lot of Democrats potentially losing their seats, or having to run in like much tougher districts. If like to look into the crystal ball, for a year and a half from now, I mean, what do you think the delegation ultimately will look like after 2026, assuming these maps stay in effect and sort of people do what they say they're gonna do?
Yeah, I mean, it's really going to cull the sort of experience of the delegation in a lot of ways. So, I mean, of the longest tenured members, you've got Doggett, who, assuming the map gets held up in court, will be gone. You've got McCall, who will be gone. Henry Cuellar is now redrawn into a district that I think he very much still could win, but he could lose. It's now a Trump plus 10 district. It was a Trump plus 7, or, he's still under indictment, and, we'll see if that goes to trial. But he was also elected in 2004, one of the longest serving members. Pete Sessions and John Carter on the Republican side have been there for quite a while, but they're, getting older. So we'll see how much longer they stay there. Mark Vesey had a district that was targeted. He's been there for a while. He could end up leaving Congress. And so I think you're just going to see a delegation that has much more junior members and, much fewer people who have really experienced like Republican Congresses, Democratic Congresses, different presidential administrations, like working with different people, have a sort of set of issues that's changed over time. And so like I think some people would say, yeah, it's good. Like let's get these people who've been there forever, these dinosaurs out. And I think some people would say, this is experience that matters when you bring it to the legislative process and when you're trying to sort of advocate for Texas specific priorities. But it's, for sure, I think going to be a much younger, much less experienced Texas delegation.
Right. And almost inevitably, I mean, certainly much more red, right? Like a little bit less,
Yeah. Right,
like,
right. I mean, we'll see if they win of those
of course.
redrawn seats, 3, 4, or 5, but I think, everyone agrees they're gonna win at least 3.
Right, right. Yeah, it's gonna be, I mean, it's just so interesting. The long tail, I think there's so much attention, of course, right now on redistricting and, well, the maps and how did they pass and the quorum break and all that. But it's like, people will win offices that they might hold for decades, as we've seen,
Right.
like this could
Right,
really
yeah.
fundamentally shift things. And like not even in good or bad ways, just like in the boring ways that your representative, gets stuff done for you in DC, that has nothing to do with politics, but is like,
No, that's part of it. I mean, it's really like a generational opportunity for ambitious Republicans in the state because there's so many friendly seats now open. I mean, big opportunity for Republican consultants too,
yeah, right,
to
yeah,
to
yeah,
make some money.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's 5 seats that could flip. There's 3 retirements. We'll see if there's more. There's also 2, big primaries, Dan Crenshaw and 2 in Houston and Tony Gonzalez and 23 along the border. Those are the potential to flip always. So yeah, there's just a huge opportunity for Republicans looking to break into federal politics in Texas.
Yeah, it's like when we think about like meticulous map drawing and then it's just like a tornado ripping through essentially. Not, just like all of these forces combined is like a tornado ripping through the delegation in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. On the other piece of the delegation, we may also see a change, which is with on the Senate side, we've got a really contentious primary between John Cornyn and longtime incumbent senator and current Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. We've talked about this race a lot on this podcast, but before we just even get into that race at all, there is like another thing sort of hanging over this of a member on the House side who we're hearing like maybe would be interested in getting into this. There's been a lot of rumblings about Wesley Hunt maybe getting into it. Another example of like youth versus experience and things like that. I mean, where does that sort of stand? I know he's been running some statewide ads and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's probably coming down to decision time for Wesley Hunt. For those who don't know, he's second term congressman from Houston area, like West Houston up to like Tomball. And he was a big surrogate for Trump during the campaign. He has been sort of, circling the waters of this Senate race. He's got aligned groups that have been putting millions of dollars into just trying to get his name ID up, I think, statewide. And so his sort of, I think the case for him would be that Cornyn is, too quote unquote moderate. And like I'm hesitant to say that because like again, on policy, it's not like him and Paxton are radically different in terms of like what their vote record would be, but vibes wise, that Cornyn can't win a primary and Paxton is a liability in general because of all his various ethical issues, and that Hunt could sort of bridge the gap of being like, he satisfies the sort of MAGA base. He was one of the first congressmen to endorse Trump when he announced he was running for re-election again in 22. But at the same time, he doesn't have any, lingering allegations of affairs and ethical issues and, all the stuff that Paxton comes with. So that's the sort of argument for Hunt. The question is like, is he well known enough in the state to like counteract 2 politicians who have been there, Cornyn forever, right? Since he was attorney general. And Paxton, who's also been attorney general since, what was it?
2014. He was elected in 2014. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that'll be the question. He hasn't gotten in yet, just, sort of circling, but filing deadlines in December, primaries in March. So I think the time is fast approaching for him to make a decision. And if he does get in, then that's another opening in the Houston area in a Republican state.
Right. Yeah. It's like everyone's sort of watching for everyone else to move to figure out what that opens up.
Yeah, like an enormous musical chairs effect for like every
yeah, it's that time of year. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, right. I mean, that race obviously so interesting and really a different entirely in the way that anytime Ken Paxton gets involved, it doesn't map onto traditional, like it's not age versus experience. Ken Paxton obviously is younger than John Cornyn, but is not pitching a necessarily a young, fresh face argument, but just really, really opposed to John Cornyn. And Cornyn obviously spoke out during Paxton's attempted impeachment and things like that. So that's a real bare knuckles fight that's almost like separate from everything else happening in the broader
Right.
parties. Yeah.
Right. But it could have the same effect, right? If Paxton
Right.
were to win, which is like taking out one of the longest tenured members of the delegation on the Senate side. And just, it would be a remaking of Texas Republicans in Congress.
For sure. I mean, you would have as your two senators, Ken Paxton and Ted Cruz, who are, both sort of firebrands in their own way. Which would be very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, a period of major, major change. It's like the only thing guaranteed is that it will be different in about a year and a half. But we are still currently, all these people still have their jobs that they have currently. And so just give us a little preview of like what is coming. We're in the middle of a major political fight at the Capitol, government shutdown and things like that. What are the things keeping the Texas delegation up at night right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think government shutdown is a big one. So the government runs out of money on September 3rd, not 3rd. Government runs out of money on September 30th. Otherwise, we'd already be there.
Right.
So if they do not pass a funding bill by then, which it doesn't look like they are because they're out all this week, and when they come back, they'll have like 2 days to figure it out, which seems unlikely. And Democrats are really not in the mood, I think, to sort of give Republicans anything, including government funding. So it seems like we're going to head to a shutdown. And I think it'll be a sort of preview of what we'll see on the campaign. Democrats are going to try to make this about healthcare. There are these tax credits for ACA enrollees that drive premiums down that are expiring at the end of the year. And so Democrats have kind of coalesced around an extension of those credits as like a demand in exchange for government funding. Whereas I think Republicans are, trying to say Democrats caused this shutdown by not voting for our bills. We're trying to do the work of the American people. Fund the military, fund the border, XYZ. And so I think it'll be a bit of a proxy war for the 26 elections. That'll be interesting. If and when a deal is eventually reached, we'll see if the usual characters, Chip Roy, Michael Cloud, Keith Self, members of the Freedom Caucus, try to stand in the way of that. And then it'll also be interesting to see, last time this happened in the spring, no House Democrats from Texas, and I think almost none in the entire caucus, supported a funding bill. And it was 10 Democratic senators who just, in exchange for nothing, basically voted with Republicans to keep the government open. And there was huge anger at Chuck Schumer over that, if people remember. I know there's so much news. And it's like
a lifetime ago.
Hard to go back to like a few months ago. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see at some point, shutdowns have to end and deals have to be reached typically. And oftentimes like the party that forces it doesn't necessarily get anything. I think that's been historically true. So we'll see, who folds and when. But if some of the Texas Democrats end up upset with what their leadership negotiates, I could definitely see that being a storyline as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly, like you said, like it. I mean, I feel like this from covering redistricting here in the quorum break and stuff. It is like inevitably all of this is just hashing out and testing out arguments for what's going to sort of sell to voters down the road. How can you sell all of this, which in some degree is your job, what your constituents want, who will send, how can you give people what they want to send you back? But it does seem to play out. And, I think, Representative McCall was saying this of like just much more, like a little bit meaner than it used to be and a little bit more for like clicks and attention and TV, which doesn't lower the temperature on anything ever.
No, certainly not. Yeah, it'll be interesting. And especially if it becomes about these tax credits, there's such a big deal in Texas because Texas never expanded Medicaid. So like the percentage of people in the state who are ACA enrollees is a lot higher than almost any other state. And so I wonder if that puts Texas Republicans who are otherwise opposed to, most federal spending like in a bind at all. So it'll be interesting to see how the politics of it play out.
Right, definitely. I'm curious, I mean, sort of before I let you go, before coming to this job, covered the Nevada's congressional delegation. Is that right?
Yep.
How does it compare? Like, what are the? Is there obviously scale is part of it? I imagine.
Scale is huge. Yeah, Nevada had 4 House members and 2 senators, and there were 5 Democrats, almost all like very polished. They all run in. The 2 senators obviously it's a swing state, and then the 3 Dems are all in like battleground districts, so they're all very careful, pretty moderate, pretty measured. And then the 1 Republican from up north was just a character who, but almost always voted with leadership, like never caused problems really for Republicans. And so it's a much broader range of like types of Republicans for me, certainly like by quantity, but also by what they're interested in. And yeah, going from a swing state to a red state is also been just like a different set of issues and things people care about. And seeing I think like the Republican infighting that happens, especially like you and other people have reported, Renzo, right? Like at the state party level and things like that is super interesting to me, just because like coming from Nevada, like both the Democrats and the Republicans, I think, tried as much as they could to like tamp down dissent because they're so focused on just getting to 50%. And so it's a different set of challenges that parties face in Texas, which I'm learning about every day and is really interesting to me.
Yeah, much more unruly bunch, which I guess anytime you've got more people, it's more personalities.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, really appreciate you sort of going through all that with us. If you want to read more about the DC shenanigans, you can find all of Gabby's reporting at texastribune.org. As we said before, this week's episode of the TribCast is brought to you by you, the members of the Texas Tribune. Our fall member drive is happening now. We need 500 Texans to make a first-time donation. Become a member today at texastribune.org/donate. Write in how much you love the TribCast, and make sure you tune in next week. Our producers are Rob and Chris. You can get the podcast anywhere you find your podcasts or on YouTube, and we will see you right before a government shutdown.